So the next thing that we need to do is we're going to be implementing post. And in the previous video I created diary entries controller, and now we need to implement post to add new entries. In order to do this, we need to create a new post method and pass diary ID from the client, and we will be inserting a new object into the current entries. So first thing that we need to do is we need to go ahead and create a post in our diary entries controller. I'll just go ahead and minimize our gets here, and I'll go ahead and create another object, and I'll call it post. So posting itself, we need to go ahead and accept parameters that we want to pass here. So what we want to pass to do our post is we want to accept diary entry model. So here we want to pass diary entry model that was added. We call it new diary entry maybe. And for now we can just return a null here. So in order to test this, we're going to test it using the fiddler. And I'll just put a breaking point right here and try to run it and see what happens when I try to insert some values. So here I have entries and the ID of 3. So this is basically going to run our controller, and I had to add here content type application JSON, and I'm adding two values here, one for quantity and the other one is our measure URL. So I executed this and I see that we got here and that we are passing this measure URL and quantity of 5 to our post, so that's working correctly. But I also want to pass the diary ID here. So it's the daytime, diary ID, and then here we need to use from body attribute, and this attribute tells the web API to take those values from the post and insert them into our new diary entry method here. New diary entry model. So now that we enabled the post and we are able to pass in our diary entry model, in order to insert this new data into database, we need to transfer this object, which is our diary entry model, into the entity. This means extracting the data from the diary entry model, parsing the measure ID from the URI, and creating an entity with this data. So this is basically an opposite of creating the model from entity. Now we had to create an entity from the model. So to begin, we'll create a try catch and create some error response, but more importantly, we are going to create the entity called diary entry from the data that we got from diary entry model by creating a parse method, and the parse method is going to be opposite of what we've done in creating the model. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. So I created a new parse method. I created a new instance of our diary entry entity, and then I made sure if new entry quantity is double, then we go ahead and assign our entity to our model. So there's the first part is the getting the quantity. The second part is actually getting the link of our measure. So the first, in order to do that, we need to parse out the string. And we do that here. We parse out the URI from new entry for measure. So in order to parse the URI, we first create a new URI object in which we pass our measure URL, and then we use int that parse, and then we use the segments that last of the measure URI object. So next step is to use this measure ID that we were able to parse out from our URL, and we use that to get an instance of our measure by calling repo get measure, but we don't really have repo in our model factory, so we'll go ahead and add that into our constructor. So we brought that into our constructor, our repo. So now we're calling our repo get measure, setting the measure ID, and then we get an instance of our measure. And then finally, in our entity that we instantiated up here, our diary entry, we go ahead and assign this measure that we just received, and for the food item we assign measure.food. So these are all the labels that we need for our entity, and then we return our entity. We should also, even our parse method though, we should go ahead and put it inside of a try catch and then return null if something goes wrong. So now we created this parse method in our model factory that takes in our new entry that we received from the client, and we assign it to our newly instantiated entry entity, which we return after we assign all the values to it, and the values are the measure, food item, and a quantity. So basically step 3 would be that parse method that we just created. And then finally we need to go ahead and finish the post. So what we need to do is we need to check if entity is null, and if it is, create an error response, bad request. So the first thing is to check if this entity that we just got back is null, and if it is, to create a bad request. So the next thing that we need to do, since our entry actually goes with the diary, we need to go ahead and bring an instance of the diary for our current user. So what we need to do is we need to bring an instance of the diary by calling the repository for the current user. And we use that by assigning var user diary, calling the repository get diary, passing the current user identity service and our diary ID, like you can see here in the code. So the next step is to add our newly created entity diary entry to the diary that we just brought in. And after we added this new entry, then we save. In order to save, we call the repository save all method. And once we save everything, we want to go ahead and return. And we want to return the model factory, create, and we want to create back the entry entity that we got here. So technically this is right, but there are still a few things here that we can do to improve the flow of this code. So we started here by saying if entry entity is null, we need to return a bad request. So initially, if entry entity is null, return a bad request. So we also want to go ahead and check if our user diary is null before we continue. And we will return error response not found if it is. And then we want to make sure it's not a duplicate. In order to make sure it's not a duplicate, we compare any of the measure IDs that we have, and we use this any right here. So we say user diary that entries any. So our user diary object that contains entries in it, we use the any to check if measure ID in our user diary list matches the newly added entry entity measure ID. And that if that happens, we return bad request. And then we do the save the entry, and we do want to add if this goes okay, if our repository save all goes okay, which is a boolean, then return our model factory, which we're going to change that into the response, and then else we return another bad request. So now we just need to go ahead and change our object to actually be HTTP response message that we're going to be passing, and we need to actually return our error responses here. So for if our entity is null, we'll return request create error response HTTP status bad request could not read diary entry in body. If our diary is null, we're going to return request create error response HTTP status code not found, no such diary. If it's duplicate, we already have this, we return a bad request. And then if everything goes okay with our saving, we want to go ahead and return our entity back to them through the request. And very important thing here is that we use HTTP status created. And then finally, if save all doesn't go okay, we want to return a response that will say HTTP status code bad request, again, could not save to the database. So basically that is implementing our post. These are the steps that we need to do in order to do it.